And I want to start by showing you my list of the places where I have privilege. I hope you've been also making that list for yourself. I heard a neat way to be able to describe them as privilege, because sometimes privilege has a bit of a negative tinge to it. It's also, think of it as advantages. So what are the advantages that you have in life? So here's some of mine. Every time I look around, I find a few more things that I can add to that. Like down here, I thought about the technology that I both have access to and that I have a lot of skill in, give me an advantage in life. What is it that are your points of privilege? How is it that you have advantages? How is it that life has given you something that allows you to navigate a little easier the world around you? Being aware of that's going to help you to figure out what not to do to assume that everyone else has that. Because if you're not aware of it, you're just going to assume that everybody else has it. We've got some background noise, so if you're not talking right now, you might want to mute yourself.
Abby, what's the matter? What's the matter?
I wanted to show you one piece of advantage that you might not have thought of. I have the privilege of being totally unaware of my own privilege. How many have that privilege? And too often that is the difficulty with us as white Americans, is that we just assume that everybody has everything that we have, which isn't true. As educated Americans, we often assume that that is true. As relatively well-to-do Americans, we have that. But the more that we don't question, we don't think about, we don't see that the spectrum is larger, we're going to possibly stand in the way of someone else's view of the world and possibly hurt them in the process. So what's your privilege? How is it that life has blessed you and gives you a chance to be able to move forward wonderfully and well?
Do you want us to just read our list?
No, I don't want you to read them at all, because that will take us forever and we'll get to nothing else. Because that's what we did last week too much. I just want you to think about it for now.
You did ask us to make a list. That's why I wondered.
Yes.
I do want you to continue to make that list and to share it with each other. Paula.
Jim, you know.
I would suggest that maybe people who haven't muted yet still need to do that, and that's up in the upper right-hand corner when you see the picture of your face.
Or in the bottom left-hand corner.
Bottom left, one of those places. That would be really appreciated. I like you, Jim. One of the first things I jumped to was I had the benefit of a great education.
Yeah,
and that's a real privilege.
And being able to know those privileges, those advantages that we have, will help us a lot in these discussions. Because whatever it is that we're overlooking and just assuming that everyone else has it is going to make it harder for us to understand who they are, why they do what they do. Let me just, go ahead, Art.
Yeah, I just said, I kind of took the point of view of those things that I had no control over, you know, instead of things that I sort of were able to do because of what I had at birth. So, you know, for me, I was born, well, white male, of course, but I was also born in a you know, middle class, stable household with, you know, parents. And because of that, all the other stuff sort of falls into place. You know, that kind of kicks it all off, I guess, for me. So I'm able to go on to good schools.
That's right. Joni and I were watching a show the other day that was talking about internships for a company, and just to talk about how much harder it might be for someone of color in a poor neighborhood to take an internship, even though they might be the most capable candidate, but they don't have the ability to easily go into New York City and take 3 months off of making money to be able to go there. Whereas an influential white child from somewhere, their parents might say, okay, we'll give you that 3-month internship. We'll pay for your rent in New York City. all kinds of things like that that we don't think about, but that we inherit in some way or another. Some of them, though, it's important to know that some of them are things that we do develop that. You know, it's not just that I have access to education, it's that I have that education. I might have worked hard for that education, but it's still an advantage that I have in life. So I want to share you a picture of another list that she made of other advantages you may not know that you have as white Americans. And this is true of all of us. Our race will determine whether or not we will survive our own birth. Some races have higher mortality rates and others have lower. It tells us where we are most likely to live and which school we will attend generally. It tells us our race will determine who our friends and partners will be, and to a very real extent, what type of careers are open to us. It determines in a very real way how much money we will earn and how healthy we will be, and even how long we can expect to live. Not the only factor in all of this, but there's direct correlation between race and all of those issues.
I saw a quote this week that said that your zip code tells you more about how long your life will live than your genetic code.
Yeah. And there's a great show that you guys should watch if you get a chance. Joni and I just watched it. It came out on June the 10th, right as all this was beginning to happen. It was Oprah Winfrey, and she's sitting with 10 amazing African-American voices, people like Embry Kendi and David Oyelowo. Amazing voices. And at one point, one of the participants said, oh, where is it? I just had it. Anyway, it said the neighborhoods that where the most money is put into them are the safest neighborhoods, always. Right? So where are those safest neighborhoods tend to be? White, affluent neighborhoods. Okay?
Not necessarily police money, though.
Whatever kind of money is put into theirs, where they're putting in a park, or they're putting in more street lamps, or they're putting in whatever it is infrastructure wide. The neighborhoods that are safest are those where the most money is placed. And so if we have neighborhoods where the opposite is true, where it's not safe, his point is that's at least one thing we can do. But see, that's an advantage we don't question, because that sits easily for me. I like having the safety in my neighborhood. I like not having to worry about. But is my liking that also making it so that I'm taking money irregardless of where else it could be spent or how else it could be spent? So I want to tell you the truth about me. Most of my adult life, even from high school on, I was in most of the spaces where I was at, I was in a place of a minority. We moved to a town called Beeville, Texas when I was a sophomore in high school, and the town had more than 50% Hispanics, and most of the people that I hung out with were Hispanic because I ran cross country, and those were who my buddies were. As I went further along in life and got my degree, I went into a field where I was a minority. I was a male teacher in lower elementary schools where I was rarely there were always less than 10 to 20% of the population that were of my gender. I, in particular, was in a school where I was teaching in a high Hispanic neighborhood called William C. Jack. So I, as a white male, was a minority, especially because I was teaching bilingual education. So most of my closest companions were Hispanic. But here's the truth about it too. even during all that time that I was a minority, I realized that I was never without power. An awful lot of power because of many of the aspects of who my privilege is, my advantages are. And we think that it's really easy for me to sit in the spaces of I have all this stuff, or look how enlightened I am because I'm in these spaces. But the reality is that I get to be there differently than my friend Gloria was there. And Gloria was a marvelous teacher. We worked together during the whole time I was at William C. Jack. And yet I had to realize that she had to do things and face things that I didn't have to do. That's what I hope this class will help us to do, is figure out how to see what we haven't seen before. So if you remember last week, we talked about race and how it's a false construct, but it does help us to determine many of the things that influence us. But in reality, it's racism, more importantly, that's there. And we want to look at systematic racism, structural racism, institutional racism, all those things which have biases built into the system that favor some of us over some of the rest of us. And if we're not very aware of that, it is going to be easy for us to just sit in that space and enjoy the benefits, but at someone else's expense. And particularly, we want to look at this word down here at the bottom, identity politics. This is what identity politics is. The term refers to the focus on the barriers specific groups face in their struggle for equality. We have yet to achieve our founding principle, that of all being equal. But any gains we have made thus far have come through identity politics. All progress we have made in the realm of civil rights has been accomplished through identity politics. Women's suffrage, the American with Disabilities Act, Title IX, federal recognition of same-sex marriage, all of that is identity politics. In this moment, part of what we're dealing with is, are we seeing the identity of our Black brothers and sisters in this moment? Or are we busy screaming they should look more like me, or letting our whiteness get in the way of their identity in the midst of? It is not to put us down, but it is to say, what do we do to help them lift up? See, all of these things that are here, women's suffrage, the American with Disabilities Act, all of those things have been positive steps for us as a nation, haven't they?
Mm-hmm.
They've been good and wonderful, and we need them. And guess what? The second truth is not just that they've been positive, but they've always been opposed by the dominant group. Every single time. And are we going to be part of that opposition? Or are we going to be part of that which will bring the next step of progress to us?
They came out of the social principles.
Somebody has me on from yesterday. You need to mute yourself.
Stories about life. They came out of prejudice.
I'm going to mute everyone, and then you can come back on in a little bit. So I'm going to do that just to stop us. Hold on just a second.
Out of their
All right. Sorry about that. So anyway, that's where we're going to come. That's where we're going to come from, is how do we step away from being the dominant group and the opposition to that which we historically see as not a good thing for us to do, because that identity politics, that each group finding their way and coming into a space has been really good for us. And if we continue to block in whatever way, but most especially because it's easiest for us, then we're stopping our own progress. We're stopping what's really good for us. Does that make sense? So I want you to think for a second back in your history, just to prove to yourself that you haven't been perfect in your racism. Where is it that you have sometimes chosen your identity over that which will help somebody else in some way or another? How is it that you have taken your advantage and enjoyed it, but maybe at the expense of someone else being helped along the way? That's the type of thing we want to be very aware of in the midst of all this. We want to make sure that we don't assume that our advantage is normal. So let me show you a meme that happened just this last month. Oops, skipped right over. Wait, where is it? No, it should be right there. I don't know where it's at. Okay, I'll come back to that. But no, let me just talk about this because this is a good one as well. Sorry that the other one is for whatever reason not there. All lives matter is something that a lot of people say. Here's the thing about it. All lives matter is a correct statement that intentionally misses the point. Rioting is wrong is a correct statement that intentionally misses the point. Not all cops are bad is a correct statement that intentionally misses the point. How is it that you are assuming a point that somebody else does not get to assume? How is it that you take advantage of something at somebody else's expense? That's what you have to be aware of. Look at this. Now I found my other picture. We'll get it up there for you. Look at this picture from this last month. It's actually two pictures placed on top of each other, and it's the same street corner in two different protests. Here was one protest, which was people complaining about having to wear face masks. Here's another street, the same street corner with another protest of people complaining about how they are being treated as a racial issue. What strikes you right away about the difference between these two corners? Now you can unmute if you want to talk.
The number of cop cars there.
The number of officers, look, not just the cars themselves, but all of these are officers.
Police presence, yeah.
Police presence. Right? Here, it actually looks like there's more people at this demonstration on top.
Yeah.
But here, there's more
Boys.
something that allows the police to have to think they have to be there. Why do we respond one way to one set of protesters and a different way to a different set of protesters?
Yeah.
Disproportionate.
Yeah. And part of that, I think we have to put into that category of white privilege. Right? And we don't question it because it benefits us. And yet look at this. Yesterday, was it yesterday, Joni, that we were watching the movie, the protest that was happening in Denver, and they're up there playing violins, and all of a sudden cops come marching into that memorial service.
Wow.
It looked peaceful to me. Didn't look like there was any need for police presence, and yet here they came marching in.
Well, and they were probably playing violins because that young man that died played the violin.
That was exactly what it was. It was a memorial service for him.
Right.
Oh.
Jim,
Yes.
if I speak personally, I'm thinking of I've never been followed by a security officer or a store employee while I'm shopping.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to relate this to a personal experience so that I can say, I can see those protesters and the disproportionate police presence, but I'm not part of that. What I am part of is people who go to stores or who are shopping or are in a restaurant, and who gets served and who doesn't get served in a restaurant.
Yeah, yeah. But part of what we have to do, if we're going to truly deal with racial issues in America, is we have to see these issues. Not because there's always bad, because there are amazing ways that we have stepped forward. All of you mentioned many of those ways of how you're better than your parents, right? When we were talking last week. But it makes us, if we're not careful, think that we've fixed it already. And at least part of what the last month has shown us is there's still a lot of work to do, right?
I don't think it's changed that much.
I think it's changed a lot, but it hasn't changed in many of the dramatic ways that it should have.
Yeah.
One of the people on the TV show that I was telling you about, Oprah's show, said, what did we do after the 1960s? What dropped off? Why did we stop at that point?
Right.
Why didn't we continue that work? And it wasn't being said in a blaming way so much as a searching way. And now's the time when we have to come back to and ask that question again in such a way that we begin answering it, not just with our words and with our spirits, but answering it in our society and politically answering it and changing what should have been changed 50 years ago. Because it's not where we got to at that point wasn't far enough, was it? And now we need to work on it. Yes.
It's Judith here. The one thing she said about how come the white kids didn't get bused to the black schools?
Yeah.
I never would have thought of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did my son did?
Oh yes.
Yeah. But there's all.
Where was that?
Here in Tucson, he went to holiday.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
There's all kinds of questions like that we should be asking on a regular basis. And not just why didn't they, but what is the really best solution? Not just for me and mine, but for us and all of us. Okay? Many of you know that as a past educator, I'm very against private schools. And it's not because they're not good schools. Do you know why? Because too often it's a way to racially support Anglos at the expense of minorities. Too often it's used that way. But are we aware of that? Or are we aware just that, well, my kid's getting a good education?
Well, and charter schools in Idaho where I taught, they didn't have to accommodate the ESL kids or the ELL kids.
That's right.
They didn't have to accommodate the kids that had handicaps.
Yeah.
So there were all kinds of ways that those students had advantages, you know, but that, I mean, it was unfortunate because they might have had the advantage, but they also didn't get to have the opportunity to be with other students that had those, you know, different races and different, you know, and different issues. But as a teacher, much easier to teach a class where everybody's pretty much on the same playing field.
It is much, much simpler. It doesn't mean it's a better educational system, right? So let me show you a primary issue of why it is that we're still in the same place. The identities of those sitting at the table of power in this country have remained remarkably similar. White, male, middle and upper class, able-bodied. And because of that dynamic, the decisions that we continue to make, whether we're under a Republican or a Democratic regime, continue to be remarkably similar types of decisions. What are we going to do to be able to change that? You have to start changing definitions. Not just the definition of who is at that table of power, but also what is expected of that table of power. It came to see that the way we are taught to define racism makes it virtually impossible for white people to understand it. Why? Because we're taught about racism in a way that continues to perpetuate what's easy for us instead of what's best for our society. Kind of like what we talked about last week. If all I see is that I stop using the N-word, that's not really a good definition of racism. If all I do is integrate schools in one way, that's not a good enough definition. If all I do really continues to benefit me, rather than truly change our society, it's not a good definition of racism. So what is that which is racism? I'm going to tell you the first thing that that I think you need to know, and you need to start from here. Racism is not about you. And you need to stop saying, I have or I don't have, because you all have racism. We just have it. It's just built in. We need to stop doing that. We need to start saying, how is racism affecting us? How is racism present in our world and in our society right now? And that's what we need to focus on. So that it's not about how bad Mary is. Well, she's not bad all the time. It's about what is it that makes it so that situations perpetuate. Problems continue to come along and we don't solve them. What is it that makes it so that 50 years after civil rights became law, we continue to not have equal access for everyone? That's the type of racism. That's where we have to define racism. And if it comes down to just, well, I have some good colored friends,
No.
then we're really not dealing with the problem. And the name of her book, White Fragility, is about when we retreat and become fragile in the conversation because it's a difficult conversation for us. Where is it that we're afraid of that larger definition so we don't step towards it? Where is it that we're afraid I'm going to lose something and so I'm going to fight you about it? On a conversation that I had this week with Dean, who's kind of a cousin of a cousin, he put up a meme that said, "No way in hell I'm going to bow down and apologize for." And, you know, all of his things were, I shouldn't have to. That's white fragility. Now, I mention him because he's probably worse than you. But how is it that in these conversations, it's way too easy for you to become centered on yourself rather than hear somebody else? Not your definition of racism, but where someone else is saying, this is where I've seen it, and I don't like that you don't see that. That's the conversation that our Black brothers and sisters are asking us to have. And specifically, they are begging us to do a particular job. Ava DuVernay, in the conversation that Joni and I were watching, she's the director of The 13th and Selma, those two movies.
Right.
She says, I want white folks to take on the labor of carrying the burden of educating each other and not leave it to the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
Not make them teach us, but us choosing to help and educate each other and our children to have a better situation here. But that means that we have to be honest about the fact that right now we benefit and that they benefit, our children do. And how do we have that true conversation and take it off of their job to do it? Take the burden for doing that. Why don't we? For a number of different reasons, probably. But I'm guessing much of it comes down to our ease.
Yeah, it's just easier not to do that.
Yep.
Very good point. You hit me in the face with that one about expecting the conversations with the blacks to help us, anyone of color to help us along. Our responsibility, from what this book seems to be about, is to take on the task of seeing what's happening. You keep pointing it out, and I keep going, oh, I don't know, really, is that where I am? Is it that bad? And yes, there was a kind of reverse racism issue in schools with my children. They were both in schools that one was in a black section of town and the other went to a school in the poor section of town. And there were special programs for those kids to go to that not a single person of color was in. So all of the people of color or the others who were poor had no benefit. Mm-hmm. My kids had the benefit, mm-hmm. but none of them did, and I was too stupid to see it. My kids saw it. My mom, this is an integration.
Yeah, and it's not always stupid. It is often just easier. Right? Easy. Sometimes we're stupid in doing that, right? But it's often just ease. We take the simple route rather than the more challenging route. We see our challenge more than what we see somebody else's need. So at the beginning of the book, she tells the story of a class that she's having, where she's teaching about, well, these issues that we're talking about. And the one man gets angry. He's pounding his fists on the table. A white man can't get a job anymore.
Right.
She asks 4 questions. Here they are. Oops. Somewhere they are. Here they are. Why is this white man so angry at this moment? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why doesn't he notice the effect this outburst is having on the few people of color in the room? And why are all the other white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or just tuning it out? Sorry, that got cut off down on the bottom. This is what we have to ask ourselves as white America. When is it that we are that white man? And how is it that we are being careless and not noticing or just ignoring what's going on around us? And when is it our job to step in and do something about what is racist? It may be true that it's more difficult for a white person to get a job, but sometimes that type of thing pales in comparison to something else that might be happening.
It sounds to me as though there's something else going on in his life, first of all. For the man to be angry when it would be obvious that 38 people in that room are white out of 40. I mean, what's the issue? The last one about the anger is many of us are taken aback by someone being angry and fearful. I would initially, years ago, I would have been fearful. I would have sat back and not said a word about his anger and the inappropriateness of what he said. And I think that's the case for the majority of us. We just don't want to engage anger when anger needs to be engaged.
That's right. Appropriate anger. We don't want it to be throwing fists at each other, all of that stuff, but we want to be there in a place where we have that indignation about you complaining about one thing when there are deeper needs over here. Or when our hearts complain about one thing when somebody else has a deeper need than mine.
Yeah.
Why is it that we don't do that? She would say white fragility, white advantage, white rage is sprouting up all over, and we as white America aren't saying that's inappropriate, that's wrong, that's not as important as. And how do we step into those spaces? It takes courage. It takes strength. It takes vision and determination, all of which take work.
Rats.
Yeah. It'd be nice if it was simple and easy, right?
Yes.
The problem is, oftentimes it also means this. Let me show you this next quote by her. Oops. White people in America live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race, and white people are the beneficiaries of that separation and inequality. As a result, we are insulated from racial stress, and at the same time that we have come to feel entitled to and deserving of our advantage. We receive an advantage, and it really isn't so much for me that we're deserving of it, but that somebody else is not. That I should get it in spite of that other person not getting it. Someone else doesn't receive that advantage, but I should still get it. I should have good schools. I should not have to worry about police stopping me. And so I'm sorry that you have to, but do you see the problem? How many know, for example, that policing in America is unequal by race?
Oh, yeah.
How many know that's a truth about our world?
Yes.
How many are right now fighting that dynamic? Are doing something to try to make it so that changes? I would venture to say that at least part of why we're not, because it doesn't affect me, not my issue, and so I don't step into that fray. Even though if policing is not helpful in America, it does bring problems for all of us. That's part of what we're seeing right now, right? George Floyd dying on a street corner because of unequal policing is affecting all of us right here in this moment. But every other death, every other part of inequity has affected us also. We were just able to close our eyes because it wasn't as close to us. And so it wasn't as challenging.
And the media didn't bring it to our attention either.
Right.
There was a lot of silence for a long time about the inequality, not the inequality, but of some of the violence.
It was
so difficult.
Yeah, and I don't want to diminish the media's impact. I think you're right that the media has a bias as well. But how many knew, for example, about some of this racial tension years ago because of Ferguson, Missouri?
Oh, yes. Oh, my
Right?
God.
Yeah.
Why weren't we doing something then? Why wasn't that enough? Does that make sense? And we could name a number of other instances that didn't pique our sense of injustice enough that we stepped into the fray. And yet our Black brothers and sisters haven't been able to be as equally unaffected. And do we notice that? And what do we do now? Because maybe we're late in the game. Maybe we should have stepped up way back in the 70s and 80s when it was better but not fixed. But what do we do now? It helps if we know that racism is a system that has been there for all of us and that we need to do something about. And that we have in the midst of that implicit bias. Everyone know what that word means?
Mm-hmm.
That because I sit in a certain space with certain types of ideas, certain types of advantages that inequality occurs. And I am not going to be as aware of the barriers you're facing. I will not see them as much, and I am going to be less motivated to remove them. And so that implicit bias makes it so that I do not help remove the barriers that you have to face every single day. And I have to become aware of them. I have to choose to become aware of them. But to do that, we have to build up what the author calls our racial stamina. That in the midst of what it is we don't, what it is that's difficult and challenging, we have to build up the ability to stay in the fray. Way too easy at a time like this. We go out and we march a couple times. We say, you know, hooray for our Black brothers and sisters, and then we slowly fade away and lose interest. We don't have the stamina to stay in the fight, to continue to help things change. It was the biggest thing that all the participants in Oprah's show said, I'm just tired now, and I need someone else to step forward and help. And who does she need to help? Mostly, not others of color, but guess what? Us. And do we have the stamina to deal with racial issues that are not going to change my world personally as much as change the world around me, that lifts all of us to a better space?
I'll admit my infirmity. When the man who occupies the White House was elected, I thought, oh my gosh, I've already been through this. I've already been through the women's issues. I've already been through discrimination. I've already been through X, Y, and Z. I don't want to do it again. I'm tired. So how do we get the stamina, Jim? You're talking to several old people up here. Not everybody, but.
First of all,
it's a question of what is it we're called to do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of levels of things that can be done.
That's
and
right.
Some require us to leave our homes and do things out in the community or beyond the community. And some require us simply to take some steps to work for the election. And we can do a lot of those from home. I mean, they're things that can be done. We can send money. We can support good candidates for office. And there are just lots of things that we can do that will help to turn some things around.
And the other thing, Jim, I think that the other thing that creates a problem is life continues to happen. You know, we focus on this, and then, you know, something in our individual lives occur. We have somebody get sick with the pandemic, you know, and so things just, it's hard to stay focused when so much else is going on.
That's true.
So let me tell you the first step towards doing it. She, at one point, as she tried to answer the question about that man at the table, she began to look at her white participants in her workshops and said, what is making them react the way they react? What are the stories they're telling themselves as they go through? And here's where she ended up. She said, many white participants, you can just see the types of things she said here. These are the lies that they told themselves, that racism was reduced to a nice people versus mean people, that it ended in 1865, you know, with the end of slavery. Many participants claimed white people are now the oppressed group. All kinds of lies that they chose to believe, that we often choose to believe, rather than the truth. What are the lies that you believe? Because it's easier for you. That's the first thing you have to do. She identifies some things that she calls the pillars of whiteness.
Yeah.
And so I want you to ask yourself honestly, which of these are ones that are easy for you to believe? I could see the power of the belief that only bad people were racist. How many flinched earlier today when I said that thing about all of you are racist? How many had a little flinch in yourself? Because
No.
we've been taught for a long
Not
time.
after reading the book.
Yeah, we've been taught for a long time that we're supposed to not be racist. But if we hold on to that belief, it'll stand in our way. How the individualism allowed white people to exempt themselves from the forces of socialization. How many? My friend Dean, that's his problem, is that he's busy saying, "I'm not to blame. I work with a bunch of black social workers, you know, who do the same job as me. I'm not," and missing the point of socialization. Or
The
are
whole
we?
issue, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just saying the whole issue of individualism is so, it really struck me reading the material about that, and made me squirm.
Yeah.
It made me feel uncomfortable, because it certainly, I thought of myself that way. I mean, that was sort of a way in which I separated myself from having to do more or be more aware, because of the individualism that is part of what we learn growing up and forever through school and professionally and whatever else we're doing in our lives. That's what we hear about.
That's exactly right. It's this, like on the third point here, a discrete act committed by an individual person. So-and-so, like in the current situation, Derek Chauvin, this officer, he's the one that's racist. He's the one who had his knee on George Floyd's neck. He's the one who's to blame. But it's larger than that, isn't it?
There were 3 other people watching.
There were 3 other police officers watching. There's a police force that's there. There's a city that's there, right? How is it that we tell the lie that it's just him or them that do it and not us? See, that individual view protects me as a white male.
Mm-hmm.
Because it makes me look much better than the rest of them. But the interconnected system means I have to figure out what else can I do to fix this. I realize she said that we see ourselves as entitled to and deserving of more than people of color deserve. We do this in a number of different ways. I worked hard to educate myself so I deserve the job I have. And he didn't. Right?
You just prompted something for me. I remember when I was a little kid, and I had a sister, and we've seen the cartoons like this in the comics where somebody made a mistake and did something wrong, and then pointed the finger at somebody else.
Yeah.
I didn't do that. She did.
Right.
Because I didn't want to accept the fact that I was responsible.
Yes.
And so it's the deeper part of this. And so what I'm thinking is consciousness of what's behind the way I behave.
Yeah.
Well, that's not very good human nature. That's just not very typical.
I know.
And I work in a system in which I want to fit into the system.
That's right.
So I get tired of listening to these word of systems. Heck, there's a system of racial discrimination. There's a system of poor health care. There's a system of education. There's systems everywhere.
That's exactly right.
And so to try to focus on one of them, all the rest of them are distracting.
Yeah.
And so I get tired of trying to sort them all out and figure out where's the priority.
But I'm going to go back to what one of the folks said. If you think you're tired, right? But no, I didn't tell you the story. Oprah at the beginning of yesterday, the session we watched yesterday in her show, told about her very first show she ever did when she did a talk show. And she brought in the lady who did the blue-eye brown eye experiment. Have you seen that? Yeah. Right. And they showed some bias against one set. And she talked about this one lady who was in the prejudiced side, the one who was victim. I mean, the not liked side, and how she was railing at the end of it, and how I was so difficult. You were so prejudiced against me. You made my life so difficult. And she said something like this: imagine how people of color have felt for hundreds of years, or any one particular colored person for their entire life. Right? It's not that it's not hard and that we haven't faced things. It's that in the perspective of what others have faced, there are things we must do. And it's because of this. Look, we have an investment in a system that serves us better than somebody else. And we reap the benefits of some of that system. And so it's easier for us to protect and maintain that system. We also know how hard we have worked in all this, right? And how hard we've worked to not have to see it. And it means we have to turn and change and be different. And that has to be intentional, and it has to be continual if we are going to change these things. And we have to fight against these last 2 points about defensiveness. And as soon as the dynamics are named, we have to be careful that we don't become defensive against it. Because we're not horribly to blame maybe, but the system continues to be there that makes it so that we benefit at someone else's expense. And so it's easy for me to just maintain my status quo at someone else's expense. And we have to work at overcoming that dynamic. Now, how many do that perfectly well so far?
Yeah, right.
The good news is how many know at least somebody who does it worse than you? So you know you're doing better, but don't let that stop you. Don't let it make it so that you become at ease with all of this. This is the moment where we get to choose. Are we going to just accept that enough was enough? Or do we move us into the next thing of what we can be? Look at what could happen because of all this. Yesterday on the news, they had this great story about I believe it was in the Denver area, about a new type of group that's responding to emergency calls. And they go out there in a vehicle that has no flashing lights. They go out there in street clothes, not in uniforms. And they go out there and they deal with mentally ill patients. Police might have come to blows with in one way or another. And instead they help them to get to the right space, the right social service, right? It's a matter of rethinking and changing how we react to this moment. Racially, socially, in all different ways, what do we expect of ourselves that's different? Not to benefit me, but to benefit us. How do we change ourselves? So what I want you to do is, as you look at those pillars of whiteness, right, those ways that we have so often constructed that which will benefit me, how do we step out of that safe space and do something that will change the world? Policing, for example, works really good for white America. Most of us feel pretty safe in America. And as a general rule, don't have worries about. That's not true of our black and usually brown brothers and sisters. There's a lot of places where they are facing things. How do we make that policing effort safe for them? What needs to change?
Liz, what do you think?
Jim, this is Sandra.
Yes, Sandra.
I have an example. I got a speeding ticket a couple of years ago, and I went to traffic school and paid the ticket. My grandson-in-law got a speeding ticket, and he went to court, and my granddaughter and I went with him, and he was given a speeding ticket because he was going 2 miles over the speed limit. And he was given a ticket because he's brown skinned.
Yeah.
And so, but when my granddaughter, who was white and I am white, went to court, the judge threw the case out.
Good.
Yeah. It's much simpler for us as white America to get out of tickets. Much more taken for granted that can happen, that we get more of the leniency. Go ahead.
Well, Mary had asked what I thought, and actually one of the things that I think I did something last Saturday is I sat in on a session. It was a Zoom session of a meeting that was held between the administration and some other folks from TPD and the NAACP, and they had a dialogue for an hour about what was wrong in Tucson and what can be done, and to have the police hear NAACP's folks talk about what they needed to see different and how things affected them, and then for TPD to then talk about what kinds of issues and answer questions about how they staff and how they're trained and just a lot of kinds of things like that. And I think that those kinds of opportunities exist for us to educate ourselves about what's happening and support movements and improvements in policing and interactions and working together to try to make a better system.
Right.
I think
Go ahead, Art.
I think a large part of the problem is it means that we who are white and middle class are going to have to give up some of our money. Nobody wants to.
Can't hear you, Harvey.
Can't hear you, Harvey.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm a little closer. Part of it is that this is going to cost something. And nobody wants to give up their bucks. It's obvious we need more people working in mental health. We need, what they're doing in Denver is simply moving mental health people in to do some of the chores that police were called upon. But this is broader. There's no reason why there should be school districts like Sunnyside School District. That's the poorest one around, and why the high school that's in my backyard should be the lowest high school in the state. We've got to do things about this. There should not be poor people who live on the streets that I pass every day. We've just got to do things differently, and that's going to cost us something. And nobody wants to fess up and say, hey, we ought to pay for it.
Yeah.
We've got to pay for it.
Yeah.
But what that means, Harvey, is that we have to choose to care about us as much as we typically care about me.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Care about the community as much as the individual. And it's much easier to care about me and mine than.
Yeah, and part of that, I think, is much deeper than even socialization.
Yeah.
I think socialization takes place because there's something at our genetic level as human beings that says we need to socialize, we need to be with people who look like us and fend off people who don't look like us, because that's what we need to survive. So we're talking about something at the very deepest level of being. End of sermon. I could sermonize on this all afternoon. I'll stop now.
The hard part is all these things have much more to talk about. That the good news is we got several weeks to go.
Good.
All right. So all the comments you have, continue to have them. Let's continue this discussion. I'm going to send you several things in the mail. I'm going to send you this article. It's an amazing article. It says,
Oh, yes.
"You want a Confederate monument? My body is a Confederate monument." You should read that. I'm going to send you this article by Stacey Abrams that I mentioned. It's where she says, I know voting feels inadequate right now, but it's a book. It's an amazing piece that way. I'm going to send you 2 different lists of ways that you can educate yourself. One is a list on books about anti-racism, and one is a book about, about movies on the African-American experience. Any of these will help to expand you beyond just yourself, which is what we have to do. What will change all this is us moving from a me to an us. Yes, Paula.
Could you also include the link to the Oprah thing that you and Joni watched? Because I happened to see it when it was on, and I thought it was a powerful experience of feeling like I was eavesdropping on a conversation that I was not expected to participate in, and it was a real privilege to hear what they said to each other.
If I can find that, I will. I saw it on network TV. I don't know if it's yet on YouTube or whatever, but I will look for it.
It's on Netflix, Jim.
Is it on Netflix?
Okay.
Wow.
What's the title, Judy?
It's called Where Do We Go From Here?
Here, yeah.
Where do we go from here? All right.
Jim, this is Ted Demotes.
Yes.
Racism is controlled by the individual. And racism is handed down from father to son and from mother to daughter.
Yes.
The person who has the problem has to get out from under himself or herself.
Right. Right.
I was born and raised in El Paso, which was about 60% Mexican.
Right.
My mother was a full German, born in Mexico City. She was run out of the country because during the Mexican Revolution of 1914. But did you feel different? Did you have any different thoughts about the Mexican kids when you went to high school? Did you feel any better that they were? Or any worse off than they were?
I've told this story before. Some of you have heard it, so I'm sorry that if I repeat myself. I have to tell you that one of the things that began changing me. I'd run with many of my friends, Mike Loya, Gilbert Arenas. We had run together for a couple of years. And midway through our junior year, they were going to cancel our summer track program. So we got together petitions and we went to get the city to pay for a summer track program. Now remember that Beeville, Texas was more than 50% Hispanic. When I got to the city council meeting, there were 3 people up on the dais, all white.
Oh.
The 2 other council members, the 2 Hispanic council members, were sitting on the front row protesting that that their race was underrepresented because of the districting. Whites controlled that council, even though Hispanics were the majority in the town.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, that made me begin to look at Mike's space and Kenneth's space and my other Hispanic friends' space and the things that they were having to see that I hadn't had to see because of my maleness, my whiteness, my privilege. And began to change my view of it. It was a system that was favoring me at their expense.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we have to look at. Because I had good relationships to those friends of mine, but was I aware of what they had to face? We're over time. Keep all these questions, all these things. We have plenty of weeks to be able to continue to talk. Thank you for being here. I will send all this stuff out to you. Sorry that we can't deal with everything and fix it all today. I wish we could. The problem is too often that's what we've tried to do is fix it in one day and not really
Are
done.
we covering 2 chapters next time?
Yeah, yes, we'll cover the next 2 chapters. I'll
Thank
send
you.
out a thing. I'll send out a revised schedule so you'll see it. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Are you going to come back, Virginia?
I got one more thing to talk about. Sorry. No, I do need to talk about this. I'm going to, because there's too many of us here for everyone to really talk, I'm going to begin to have a session on the same class on Tuesday nights. And we'll start from this point. Not Tuesday nights, but Tuesday afternoons. How many of you could come just as easily at 3 o'clock on Tuesday?
Good.
If you can, just know that I will be doing it that day as well. Okay? Same discussion, same things we've already dealt with, and that'll half us more or less, so that maybe we'll have more time for everyone to talk. Because I know that that's been one of the frustrations, even just today, where you've had to listen to me too much and not each other enough.
What time, Jim?
Same time, 3 o'clock on Tuesday or 3 o'clock on Thursdays. So whichever day you want to, is that okay? Will that work for people?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
And also, can we kind of go between the 2 days because some.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If for whatever reason you can't make whatever your usual time is, then come to the other one. And as always, all of these will be recorded and they're available for you to catch up. If I don't have your email address, please put it into the comments, the chat space, so that I make sure you get all these handouts that I talked about. Most of you I have, but if for whatever reason you think I don't have yours, then let me know. Or just at least put me a note that says, send it to me. Okay?
So Jim, are you going to assign us to one of those 2 days?
Nope, I'm going to let you choose. And if all of you choose one day, then I'm going to force some of you to come to the other.
Good luck. Start next Tuesday, right?
Yeah, next Tuesday at 3. Whoever can come then. And if you need to stay on Thursday. Not all of you need to change the Tuesday. So you can decide. All right?
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jim.